A blind puppy was just minutes away from being put down, until the vet spotted something on his collar. 5 small words, scratched into old leather, stopped everything. "My name is Scout. I find things." She was only doing her job, but in that moment her hands started shaking, because something deep inside told her this dog was different. How could a blind, discarded puppy have anything left to give? And why did those words on his collar feel like a message meant just for her? What this vet discovers next will not only save the dog's life, but completely change her own. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The morning fog hung thick and heavy over Westbridge, turning the world into various shades of gray. Elise Warren pulled her old Honda into the empty parking lot of the Valley View Veterinary Clinic, the crunch of gravel under her tires, the only sound breaking the dawn silence. She sat for a moment, staring at the weathered building through her windshield. Paint peeled from its wooden siding, and a few shingles had worked loose during the last storm. Her watch showed 6:45 a.m., early as usual. She preferred it this way, the quiet hours before the day officially began, before she had to paste on a professional smile and face her clients. Elise grabbed her travel mug and laptop bag, then made her way to the back entrance, her key stuck in the lock like it always did. The door creaked open to reveal the dark hallway, and she flipped on the lights. Fluorescent bulbs buzzed to life, casting a harsh glow over the linoleum floors and mint green walls. In the break room, she dumped out yesterday's coffee and mechanically went through the motions of making a fresh pot. While it brewed, she walked through her morning checklist. Check inventory, review appointments, prepare examination rooms. Her movements were practiced, efficient, devoid of any real engagement. The coffee maker sputtered its last drops. Elise poured herself a cup, not bothering with cream or sugar. The bitter liquid was just fuel now, nothing more. She settled at her desk, pulling up the day's schedule on her ancient desktop computer. First appointment, routine vaccinations. Second, possible ear infection. Third, euthanasia. Her fingers paused over the keyboard. Even after 5 years of practice, that word never got easier to read. The back door opened again at 7:30. Marco Rivera's familiar footsteps echoed down the hallway. "Morning, Doc," he called out, his voice warm despite the early hour. Elise managed a small nod. "Morning." She watched as Marco went about his own preparation routine, his movements careful and deliberate. He'd been her vet tech for 3 years now, and she appreciated how he never pushed for more conversation than she was willing to give. At 8:15, the phone rang. County Animal Services. They were bringing in a special case, a German Shepherd puppy scheduled for euthanasia. Overcrowding at the shelter meant difficult decisions, especially for animals deemed unadoptable. The shelter volunteer arrived 20 minutes later, carrying a small bundle wrapped in a threadbare blanket. The puppy was thin, his coat dull and patchy in places. When the volunteer set him down on the examination table, his legs wobbled uncertainly. Elise picked up the intake sheet, her eyes scanning the sparse information. Unknown name, male, approximately 5 months, bilateral corneal opacity, suspected congenital blindness. The clinical words matched the detachment she'd cultivated over the years. The puppy's clouded eyes stared unseeing into the middle distance, but his ears swiveled at every small sound. His nose worked constantly, taking in the unfamiliar environment. Despite his condition, there was an alertness about him, a quiet dignity that made something twist in Elise's chest. She pushed the feeling away. Marco helped her prepare for the procedure, laying out the supplies with practiced efficiency. The puppy remained calm as Elise administered the sedative, his tail giving a single weak wag when Marco scratched behind his ears. As they waited for the medication to take effect, Marco absently fingered the worn leather collar around the puppy's neck. His fingers caught on something under the buckle. "Hey, wait a minute." He leaned in closer, squinting at what appeared to be an engraving, partially obscured by scratches and wear. "There's something here." Elise had already filled the syringe with the final injection. She paused, watching as Marco carefully turned the collar to catch the light. "My name is Scout," he read slowly, his voice growing softer. "I find things." There was a pause before he finished the last words. "Please don't give up on me." The syringe trembled slightly in Elise's hand. The puppy, Scout, had begun to drift under the sedative's influence, but his nose still twitched, seeking them out. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The wall clock ticked. Each second stretched like taffy. Elise stared at the syringe, then at the puppy. The message on his collar echoed in her mind, cutting through layers of carefully constructed professional distance. His name was Scout. He had a purpose, even if others couldn't see it. He found things. Without a word, Elise set the syringe down on the metal tray. The soft click seemed to break whatever spell had fallen over the room. She gathered the drowsy puppy in her arms, wrapping him securely in a clean towel. His small body was warm against her chest, his heartbeat steady. Marco watched in stunned silence as Elise carried Scout to her office. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her with one hand, the decisive click of the lock echoing in the quiet hallway. Through the office window, Marco could see Elise sitting in her chair, the bundled puppy cradled in her lap. Her face was turned away from the glass, but something in her posture had changed. The rigid professional detachment had cracked just slightly, like a thin sheet of ice giving way to spring. Scout's head rested trustingly against her arm, his clouded eyes closed in sedated sleep, unaware that his simple engraved message had just changed the course of his fate. The evening shadows lengthened across the clinic floor as Elise sat cross-legged beside Scout's crate, her back against the wall. The gentle patter of rain against the windows created a soothing rhythm, interrupted only by the occasional rumble of distant thunder. Scout lay curled in the soft blankets she'd placed in the crate, his breathing steady and calm after the sedative had worn off. Elise's laptop cast a blue glow across her tired face, illuminating the scattered pile of unopened mail beside her. Bills, probably. Reminders of the clinic's precarious financial state. She pushed them aside, focusing instead on the search bar before her. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before typing, "K9 Scent Training for Blind Dogs." The search results populated her screen, but her heart sank as she scrolled through them. Most were dead-end forum discussions or blog posts filled with well-meaning speculation. Nothing concrete, nothing scientific. A few posts mentioned success stories, but they were anecdotal at best. She clicked through several links, making mental notes of any useful information, no matter how small. The clock on her laptop showed 8:45 p.m. when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Marco's familiar knock followed, and he pushed the door open with his elbow, his hands full with what looked like takeout containers. "Thought you might be hungry," he said, setting the containers on her desk. The warm aroma of his wife's homemade enchiladas filled the small office. "Nina made extra tonight." Elise managed a small smile, but didn't move from her spot on the floor. Scout's nose twitched at the smell of food, and his tail gave a slight wag against the blankets. Marco pulled up Elise's office chair and sat down, his eyes moving from Scout to the research displayed on her laptop screen. He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "So, Want to tell me why our scheduled euthanasia case is still here?" Elise shrugged, her fingers idly adjusting the corner of Scout's blanket through the crate bars. "I need to observe him for neurological signs before proceeding," she said, the lie feeling thick in her throat. "The shelter's paperwork was incomplete. We should be thorough." Marco nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Still, true to his nature, he didn't push the issue. Instead, he opened one of the takeout containers and placed it near Elise, along with a plastic fork. "Eat something, at least. It's been a long day." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sharing the meal while the rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows. As they ate, Scout began to stir in his crate. Elise watched as he carefully got to his feet, his nose working constantly to map his surroundings. She opened the crate door, and Scout stepped out with surprising steadiness. His clouded eyes might not have worked, but his other senses were clearly sharp and active. He moved around the office with careful precision, using the sound of the rain and the echo of his own footsteps to orient himself. His whiskers brushed against the desk legs and filing cabinet, creating a mental map of the space. Elise's attention was drawn to a cardboard box in the corner labeled "Lost and Found." Among the miscellaneous items inside, a worn plush bear caught her eye. The toy had been left behind by a client months ago, never claimed despite their calls. An idea formed in her mind. She retrieved the bear and studied it for a moment. The stuffed animal had seen better days. One ear was slightly torn, and the fur was matted from years of love. But it still had that distinct softness that drew dogs to their favorite toys. Without saying a word, Elise crossed the office and placed the bear on the opposite side of the room, tucking it partially behind her reference books on the bottom shelf. Scout, who had been investigating the area near his crate, lifted his head at the sound of her movement. His nose twitched as he caught the scent of the toy. He stood still for a moment, head tilted slightly, processing the new smell. Then, with deliberate movements, he began to circle the room. Once, twice, each rotation bringing him closer to the bear's location. His nose led the way and his paws moved with surprising confidence despite his blindness. Marco watched in silence as Scout made his way across the office. When the puppy's nose finally bumped against the shelf where the bear sat, his tail began to wag. With careful precision, he extracted the toy from its hiding place and carried it back to his crate, proud of his achievement. Elise had grabbed her notebook and was already jotting down observations. Time elapsed, movement patterns, environmental factors. She recorded everything with scientific precision, though her hand trembled slightly as she wrote. The rain grew heavier outside as the night deepened. Marco had left hours ago, but Elise remained, alternating between research and watching Scout navigate his new environment. The puppy had made himself at home, seeming to grow more confident with each passing hour. Finally, around midnight, Elise opened her email. The cursor blinked steadily as she composed a message to the rescue. "Need 1 week extension. Monitoring condition." She hit send before she could second-guess herself. Scout had settled back into his crate, the rescued bear tucked against his side. His clouded eyes were closed, his breathing deep and regular in sleep. The sight made something shift in Elise's chest, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to experience in a long time. "I'm not ready to let you go," she whispered into the darkness of the office, her words barely audible above the steady drumming of the rain. Standing up, she switched off the lights, leaving only the soft glow of her laptop screen. The rain continued its gentle symphony against the windows, a lullaby for both the sleeping puppy and the veterinarian who had chosen, just for now, to believe in second chances. 2 days had passed since Scout's arrival at the clinic. The afternoon sun filtered through the break room's dusty blinds, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. The usual rush of morning appointments had slowed to a trickle, giving the staff a rare chance to eat lunch together. Elise sat at the break room table, picking absently at her sandwich, while Marco and Janet, the clinic's receptionist, chatted about their weekend plans. Her attention wasn't on the conversation or her food, but on the engagement ring she twisted around her finger, a habit she'd developed over the past 6 months since James had called off the wedding. The ring caught the sunlight, throwing tiny rainbows against the wall. It should have been returned months ago, like the venue deposits and the wedding dress. But somehow, she couldn't bring herself to face that final admission of failure. The malpractice case had cost her more than her reputation. It had cost her the future she'd planned. "Earth to Elise," Janet's voice cut through her thoughts. "Your sandwich is turning into crumbs." Elise looked down at her plate where she'd unconsciously shredded her bread into tiny pieces. "Sorry," she mumbled, brushing the mess into a neat pile. "Just thinking." Marco shot her a knowing look but didn't comment. Instead, he steered the conversation toward safer territory, the upcoming vaccine clinic they were planning for the local shelter. Janet launched into her ideas for advertising, her enthusiasm filling the quiet room. The lunch hour passed quickly, and as they cleaned up, Elise reached to gather her dishes. Her hand brushed against her finger, and she froze. The familiar metal band was gone. "My ring," she said, her voice tight. "It's gone." Janet immediately dropped to her knees, peering under the table. "When did you last have it?" "Just now I was—" Elise's words trailed off as she scanned the floor. "I was fidgeting with it during lunch." Marco joined the search, methodically checking each corner of the break room. They moved furniture, swept floors, and checked every possible surface where the ring might have rolled. 15 minutes of increasingly frantic searching yielded nothing. Frustrated and trying to keep her composure, Elise sank into the chair next to Scout's crate. The puppy had been quietly observing the commotion, his head tilted at the sound of their movements. "Guess you can't help me find this one, huh?" she muttered, more to herself than to Scout. But something in her voice made Scout's ears perk up. He rose from his bed in the crate, nose working the air in quick, deliberate sniffs. With careful steps, he made his way out of the crate and across the break room floor. Elise watched as Scout moved with purpose, his nose leading him toward the refrigerator. He stopped at its base, where a metal vent cover was installed in the floorboard. His paw scratched gently at the edge of the vent, and he whined softly. "What's he doing?" Janet asked, watching the puppy's focused behavior. Marco knelt beside Scout, examining the vent cover. "Hold on," he said, reaching for the multi-tool he kept in his pocket. "Let me check this out." With a few quick turns of the screwdriver, Marco removed the vent cover. He reached inside with careful fingers, feeling along the dusty metal surface. There was a soft metallic clink, and then Marco's hand emerged, holding Elise's engagement ring. The break room fell silent. Elise stared at Scout, then at the ring, her expression unreadable. The puppy sat quietly, tail wagging slightly, seeming pleased with himself. Janet broke the silence first. "Did he just... How did he—" But Elise wasn't listening. Her mind was racing, processing what she'd just witnessed. Without a word, she took the ring from Marco and slipped it into her pocket. For the rest of the afternoon, she moved through her appointments mechanically, her thoughts elsewhere. As the last client left and Janet headed home, Elise began gathering items from around the clinic. She collected several small plastic cups from the water cooler, a handful of dog treats, and a few tennis balls from the clinic's toy box. In the empty exam room, she arranged 3 cups upside down on the floor. Under one, she placed a treat, Scout sat patiently as she worked, his nose twitching at the scent of food. "Find it," she said softly, stepping back. Scout moved forward without hesitation. He sniffed each cup carefully, then pawed at the one hiding the treat. Elise repeated the test, changing the treat's location each time. Scout found it every time, his accuracy unwavering. She moved on to hiding tennis balls in increasingly challenging spots, behind cabinet doors, under exam tables, in corners behind equipment. Scout located each one, his confidence growing with every success. As the evening deepened outside the clinic windows, Elise sat at her desk, Scout dozing contentedly nearby. Her laptop hummed to life, and her fingers moved across the keyboard. Can blind dogs be scent trackers? The next morning arrived with a crisp autumn chill. Elise's car pulled into the empty parking lot while the sun was still struggling to break through the morning fog. Her movements were different today, purposeful, charged with an energy that had been absent for months. She unlocked the clinic's back door, flicking on lights as she made her way through the quiet building. Scout's tail thumped against his crate when he heard her footsteps. Instead of her usual morning routine of coffee and charts, Elise headed straight for the storage room. She emerged carrying several cardboard boxes of various sizes, arranging them in a careful grid pattern on the floor of the back room. The space, usually reserved for storing medical supplies, had been cleared the evening before. Elise pulled her half-eaten turkey sandwich from her bag, broke off a piece, and concealed it in one of the middle boxes. Scout waited patiently in his crate, his nose working the air as the scent of food reached him. Elise checked her watch. Still 45 minutes before Marco was due to arrive. Plenty of time for their morning session. "Okay, buddy," she said softly, opening Scout's crate. "Find it." Scout stepped out carefully, his head held high as he processed the various scents in the room. His movements were becoming more confident with each passing day, paws sure against the floor as he navigated between the boxes. He circled the grid once, then twice, before stopping at the box containing the sandwich piece. His tail wagged as he indicated the correct box with a gentle paw. "Good boy," Elise whispered, rewarding him with the treat. Over the next several days, a routine developed. Elise arrived early each morning, setting up increasingly complex scent trials for Scout. A spiral notebook appeared on her desk, its pages filling with detailed observations. Day 4, Scout located target item, tennis ball, in 47 seconds despite interference scent, coffee grounds. Day 5, successfully identified correct box containing owner's keys among 12 identical containers. Day 6, located hidden treat despite vertical placement second shelf. Her Amazon cart grew steadily fuller. Professional scent work equipment, training guides, puzzle feeders designed for working dogs. She had them delivered to her home address rather than the clinic, not ready to field questions from her colleagues about her growing collection of training supplies. The following Tuesday, Elise loaded a cooler of vaccines into her car for the monthly shelter delivery. Scout rode in the back seat, his head tilted toward the open window. The shelter was quiet when they arrived, most of the staff busy with morning cleanings. While the shelter manager, Dave, counted and signed for the vaccines, Elise casually steered the conversation toward Scout's history. "By the way," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral, "I've been curious about where Scout came from. Any background information in his intake files?" Dave shrugged, barely looking up from the paperwork. "Not much to tell. No chip, no collar except that old beat-up one he came with. Probably another dump job." He paused, scratching his chin. Though come to think of it, might have been from that K9 breeding program they shut down last year. You know the one. Started having issues with genetic defects. Eyes, hips, whatever. They culled the whole line. Elise's pen stilled over the delivery form. "Which program was that?" "Can't remember the name. Big operation, though, out near the state line. Made the local news when they closed up shop. That evening, after the clinic closed, Elise sat at her computer, Scout curled up in his new bed beside her desk. Her search history filled with phrases like discontinued K9 breeding programs and genetic defects, working dogs. After an hour of dead ends, she found a private forum for working dog breeders. The site required registration, but using her veterinary credentials, she gained access to the archived threads. She scrolled through months of posts until a title caught her eye. Coda's last litter, blind male pup discarded due to early corneal disease. Her heart quickened as she clicked the link. The post was brief, clinical in its description of a promising breeding line terminated due to genetic complications. Near the bottom was a photo, slightly blurry but clear enough. A small German Shepherd puppy, maybe 8 weeks old, with clouded eyes and a distinctive white patch on his chest, identical to Scout's. Elise's printer hummed to life, producing a copy of the photo. She picked it up, studying the image closely, before pinning it to the bulletin board beside her desk. Scout lifted his head at the sound of the thumbtack pressing into cork, his ears perked forward. Looking at the sleeping dog beside her, then back at the photo of the unwanted puppy he had once been, Elise felt something shift inside her chest. "Maybe you weren't meant to see things," she said softly. "Maybe you were meant to find them." Scout's tail thumped gently against his bed, responding to the warmth in her voice, while outside the window, night settled over the quiet clinic. The next morning brought a surprise to the clinic. When Elise pushed through the front door, she found Marco sitting in one of the worn waiting room chairs. But he wasn't alone. Beside him sat a teenage girl with long dark hair that partially covered her face. She wore oversized noise-canceling headphones and kept her eyes fixed on the tablet in her lap. "Hey," Marco said quietly. "Hope you don't mind. Nina's got the day off from school. Teacher Development Day." Elise nodded, studying the girl without staring. Nina's shoulders were slightly hunched, her body language suggesting she wanted to make herself as small as possible in the unfamiliar space. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and even Elise had to admit they were harsh this early in the morning. "Of course not," Elise replied, keeping her voice low. She moved behind the reception desk and opened the small fridge where they kept drinks for clients. "Would you like some juice?" she asked, directing the question to Nina, but not expecting a response. She placed an apple juice box on the counter, leaving it there as an open offer. Scout lay on his bed near the desk, his ears perking up at the sound of new voices. His tail gave a gentle thump against the cushion, but he remained in his spot, seeming to sense the delicate atmosphere. After a few moments, Nina's eyes flickered toward the juice box. She set her tablet down and reached for it with careful movements, her fingers wrapping around the small carton. Marco watched with held breath as she removed the straw from its plastic wrapper and took a small sip. That's when Scout made his move. He rose from his bed with the measured grace he'd developed to compensate for his blindness. His paws made soft clicking sounds on the linoleum as he approached Nina's chair. There was nothing rushed or startling about his movement, just a gentle, steady advance. Nina's eyes widened slightly behind her hair, but she didn't pull away. Scout's tail continued its soft wagging as he drew closer. When he reached her side, he simply sat, allowing his body to rest lightly against her leg. The contact was so subtle it could have been accidental, but Elise recognized it as intentional. She'd seen him use the same technique during their training sessions, using touch to orient himself. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, moving with the same deliberate care that Scout had shown, Nina lifted her hand. It hovered uncertainly in the air before settling on Scout's head. Her fingers threaded through his fur, and something remarkable happened. A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Marco's sharp intake of breath was barely audible. His eyes met Elise's, and she saw something in them she couldn't quite name. Wonder, perhaps, or hope. The morning passed quietly. Nina remained in the waiting room with Scout while Marco helped with the day's appointments. Every time Elise passed through, she found the girl and dog in comfortable companionship. Sometimes Nina would stroke Scout's fur. Other times they simply sat together, sharing space without demands. It wasn't until the afternoon lull that Elise found a moment to talk with Marco. They stood in the break room, watching through the window as Nina showed Scout her tablet, pointing to something on the screen, though he couldn't see it. "I've never seen her like this," Marco said softly. "Usually she can't stand being touched. Even a brush against her arm can be too much." Elise measured her words carefully before speaking. "Can I ask about her condition?" Marco nodded, his eyes still on his daughter. "Sensory processing disorder. Her brain processes stimuli differently than most people's. Sounds, textures, lights. Everything can become overwhelming really quickly. It's why she wears the headphones." He ran a hand through his hair. "Most people don't understand. They think she's being difficult or antisocial, but she's just trying to cope with a world that's too intense sometimes." "But Scout doesn't overwhelm her," Elise observed. "No," Marco agreed, something like wonder in his voice. "Maybe it's because he's blind. He moves slower, more predictably. There's no eye contact to worry about, no sudden movements. He just accepts her exactly as she is." They watched as Nina carefully placed a treat on the floor, letting Scout find it with his nose. Her smile, though small, remained. Later that evening, after the clinic had closed and Nina and Marco had gone home, Elise sat at her desk with her journal open before her. Scout dozed in his bed nearby, tired from a day of gentle companionship. She picked up her pen and wrote, "Scout may have therapy potential. Nina connection, not coincidence." The words stared back at her, full of possibility. Setting down her pen, she turned to her computer and opened a new browser window. Her fingers moved across the keyboard, typing out a search. A moment later, she hit the print button and the printer hummed to life. She retrieved the fresh sheet of paper, its heading clear and bold, "Requirements for Therapy Dog Certification." 3 days passed in a blur of training sessions and regular clinic duties. Elise was reviewing patient files when her cell phone buzzed on the desk. The number was unfamiliar, but she answered anyway, expecting another supplier call. "Doctor." "Warren speaking," she said, her voice professional but tired. "Doctor." "Warren, this is Dr. Kendra Holloway." The voice on the other end was warm, but carried an unmistakable authority. "I'm returning your email about the blind German Shepherd puppy you're working with." Elise sat up straighter, her heart suddenly racing. Dr. Holloway was a legend in working dog circles. Her name appeared on half the research papers Elise had been reading late into the nights. "Yes, thank you for calling," Elise managed, trying to keep her voice steady. "I appreciate you taking the time." "I read your notes with interest," Kendra continued. "As it happens, I'm passing through Westbridge next week for a conference. I could stop by your clinic, take a look at what you're doing." Elise's hand tightened on the phone. Yes, that would be wonderful." They settled on a time, and after hanging up, Elise sat in silence for several moments. Scout, sensing her tension, lifted his head from his bed in the corner. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Elise rescheduled all non-emergency appointments for the afternoon of Kendra's visit. She had Marco help her deep clean every surface in the clinic until the usual antiseptic smell was overwhelmed by lemon-scented cleaner. Even the waiting room magazines were arranged in neat chronological stacks. The morning of the visit, Elise arrived 2 hours early. She ran through basic commands with Scout in the back room, her hands shaking slightly as she rewarded each successful find with pieces of boiled chicken. "Good boy," she murmured as he located a hidden toy for the third time. "Just like that. Nice and steady." At exactly 10 o'clock, a silver SUV pulled into the parking lot. Elise watched through the window as Dr. Holloway emerged, a tall woman in her 50s with steel gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore practical khakis and a polo shirt with a Service Dog Training Organization's logo embroidered on the breast. Elise met her at the door, wiping her sweaty palms on her scrubs before extending her hand. "Dr. Holloway, thank you so much for coming." Kendra's handshake was firm but friendly. "Please call me Kendra. And this must be Scout?" The puppy had appeared at Elise's side, his nose working overtime to process the new scents. His tail wagged slowly, neither fearful nor overexcited. "Good natural restraint," Kendra noted, watching Scout's behavior. "May I?" At Elise's nod, she knelt down and let Scout investigate her hands. Her movements were slow and deliberate, professional assessment evident in every gesture. "Tell me everything," Kendra said as she straightened up. "Start with his background. Whatever you know about it." They moved to Elise's office, where she had prepared a folder with all her notes and findings. As they sat, Elise explained about finding Scout's engraved collar, the scheduled euthanasia she couldn't go through with, and her subsequent research into his likely breeding history. "The forum post mentioned Coda's line," Kendra interrupted, her eyebrows raising. "Interesting. They produced some exceptional tracking dogs before the genetic issues started showing up." Elise nodded, pulling up the saved thread on her laptop. "I've been keeping detailed records of his progress. He started with simple find-it games, but we've moved on to more complex searches." She handed over her training log, filled with daily entries and observations. Kendra read through several pages, occasionally making small sounds of approval. "Your methodology is sound, very systematic. Tell me about his daily routine, exercise, diet, enrichment activities." For the next half hour, Elise answered a steady stream of questions about everything from Scout's protein intake to his sleeping habits. Kendra's manner was warm but focused, each answer clearly being filed away for evaluation. Finally, Kendra reached into her bag and pulled out a small kit. "I'd like to run a few trials, if you don't mind. Do you have access to an enclosed outdoor space?" Elise led them to the fenced yard behind the clinic, where she sometimes let recovering patients stretch their legs. The morning sun had burned away the early fog, leaving the air clear and still. Kendra set up 5 identical plastic containers at various points around the yard. From her kit, she produced several small vials of clove oil. "Novel scent," she explained as she carefully placed drops in some of the containers. "He won't have encountered this before, which makes it a good test of his general detection abilities rather than learned association." Scout waited by Elise's side, his head tilted as he processed the new smell. When Kendra gave the signal, Elise released him with their usual command: "Find it." The puppy's initial movement was hesitant. He circled the yard's perimeter first, gathering information, before moving toward the containers. His first pass missed 2 of the scented ones, but on his second sweep, his indication became more confident. He sat briefly at each positive find, a behavior Elise had been working to establish. In just under 10 minutes, Scout had successfully located 3 of the 5 hidden scents. He missed one entirely and gave a false positive on an unscented container. But his overall performance was remarkably focused for a puppy with no formal detection training. "Well," Kendra said, packing away her kit, "I'll be honest, I wasn't sure what to expect when I got your email. A blind puppy doing scent work, but he's got real potential." Relief flooded through Elise's body. She hadn't realized how much she'd been holding her breath, waiting for validation that she wasn't crazy for seeing something special in Scout. Back in the office, Kendra reached into her bag one final time. She produced a business card and held it out to Elise. "He's not standard, but neither are the best dogs I've worked with. Keep going. Call me if you hit walls." Elise took the card carefully, as if it might disappear. She opened her training notebook and tucked it securely inside the front cover. At her feet, Scout settled down with a contented sigh, his tail wagging gently against the floor. The evening sun cast long shadows across the clinic's empty parking lot as Elise organized the last of her paperwork. Scout dozed in his usual spot near her desk, his chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. The quiet was broken only by the gentle hum of the aging heating system and the occasional shuffle of papers. Then came the sound of sirens in the distance. At first, Elise barely registered them, just another emergency vehicle on the highway. But the wailing grew closer, and more sirens joined the chorus. Scout's head lifted, his ears twitching at the commotion. The front door burst open with such force that it rattled the window blinds. Mrs. Chen from the hardware store next door stumbled in, her normally neat gray hair disheveled and her breathing heavy. "They're looking for a girl," she gasped, gripping the edge of the reception counter. 6 years old, lost up by the Pine Hollow Trail. They've got dogs, but nothing's working." Elise's stomach tightened. Pine Hollow was dense forest, full of steep ravines and thick undergrowth. Even in daylight, it was easy to get turned around. And now, with dusk approaching, she glanced at Scout, who had moved to stand beside her, his tail low but steady. He was only 5 months old. His training consisted of finding hidden toys and tracking simple scent trails around the clinic yard. This was different. This was real. But something nagged at her. That forum post about his bloodline, Coda's line. Some of the best tracking dogs in the state had come from that breeding program. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for Scout's training harness hanging by the door. "Mrs. Chen, where exactly are they searching?" "The main parking lot at Pine Hollow. They've got emergency vehicles, volunteers." Mrs. Chen wrung her hands. Poor thing must be so scared. Elise grabbed her phone and dialed Marco's number as she clipped Scout's harness in place. He answered on the second ring. "I need you to meet me at Pine Hollow," she said, already gathering her keys and emergency kit. "Bring any high-value treats you can find in the clinic kitchen." "What's going on?" "Lost child. I'm bringing Scout." There was a pause. "Are you sure that's—" "No," Elise cut him off. "I'm not sure at all. But I have to try." The drive to Pine Hollow took 12 minutes. Elise's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as Scout sat quietly in the passenger seat. Red and blue lights painted the trees at the trailhead parking lot where a crowd of emergency vehicles and volunteers had gathered. Elise parked at the edge of the lot and took a deep breath. Scout's nose was already working overtime, taking in the chaos of scents around them. She clipped his lead in place and walked toward the command center, a folding table set up near the largest police vehicle. A woman in a search and rescue vest intercepted them before they reached the table. "Ma'am, this is a closed search area. We appreciate the offer, but we need to keep the space clear for emergency personnel." "I have a tracking dog," Elise said, trying to keep her voice steady. "He's from Coda's line." "We're not taking liabilities," the woman cut her off firmly. "We need trained dogs only. We've already got 3 K9 units working the area." Elise's chest tightened. Of course they wouldn't want an untrained puppy. What had she been thinking? She turned to leave, guiding Scout back toward the car. "Wait!" A man's voice, rough with emotion, called out behind them. "Did you say Coda's line?" Elise turned to see a tall man in his 40s pushing through the crowd. His face was drawn with worry, but his eyes fixed on Scout's collar tag with intense focus. "Yes," Elise said. He's He's from Coda's last litter." The man knelt down, holding his hand out for Scout to smell. "I'm Rick. Coda was my partner for 8 years. Best nose in the department." He looked up at Elise, then at the SAR officer. "This is my daughter we're looking for, Maggie. If this pup has that blood, let him try." The SAR officer hesitated, looking between Rick and Scout. "He's not certified. The liability—" "15 minutes, Rick said. "Give them 15 minutes. The other dogs lost the trail where the creek crosses the path. We're running out of daylight." A tense silence followed. Finally, the officer nodded. 15 minutes, no more." She turned to another volunteer. "Get the scent article." Moments later, Elise found herself holding a well-loved stuffed rabbit. The pink fur was matted and worn, clearly a favorite toy. "This is Maggie's," Rick explained, his voice thick. "She takes it everywhere." Elise knelt beside Scout, who was already sniffing the air with interest. She held the rabbit close to his nose, using the command they'd practiced countless times in the clinic. "Find it." Scout's demeanor changed instantly. His body tensed, nose working furiously as he processed the scent. He circled once, twice, then pulled firmly toward the trailhead. Elise's hand shook as she gripped the lead, but she forced herself to focus. This wasn't a training exercise. This wasn't a game. Somewhere in these woods, a little girl was lost and scared. "He's got something," she said quietly. Rick stepped forward. "I'm coming with you." The SAR officer nodded and spoke into her radio. "Team 3, we've got another dog working the trail. Stand by for updates." She gestured to 2 volunteers with powerful flashlights. "Stay with them. Radio if you find anything." Scout pulled steadily along the main trail, his nose low to the ground. Despite his blindness, he moved with surprising confidence over the uneven terrain. Elise followed his lead, trusting his instincts as they had practiced so many times before. Behind them, she could hear the crunch of leaves as Rick and the volunteers followed, their flashlight beams cutting through the growing darkness. The sun had nearly set now, painting the sky in deep purples and blues above the tree line. Scout paused at the creek crossing, where the other dogs had lost the trail. His nose worked overtime, testing the air. For a heart-stopping moment, Elise thought he might be lost too. But then he turned sharply left, pulling them along the creek bank with renewed purpose. "The other teams went right," one of the volunteers whispered. Rick's voice was tight with hope. "Keep going. Trust the dog." Scout continued forward, his determination unwavering as they moved deeper into the darkening woods. The rain started as a gentle mist, barely noticeable through the canopy of pine needles above. Scout's paws splashed through muddy puddles as he pulled steadily forward, his nose working overtime to filter through the complex web of forest scents. Elise gripped the leash tightly, her shoes already soaked through from crossing the creek. Behind her, Rick's breathing was heavy but determined. The 2 volunteers swept their flashlight beams in wide arcs, illuminating the increasingly dense undergrowth. Scout paused briefly at a fork in the trail, where orange marking tape indicated the other search teams had already covered the right-hand path. "They searched that whole section twice," one of the volunteers mentioned, his voice tight with concern. "Nothing." But Scout wasn't interested in the marked trail. After a moment's consideration, he pulled left toward a less traveled area thick with fallen branches and thorny bushes. Elise's heart pounded as she followed, ducking under low-hanging limbs and stepping carefully over slick logs. The rain intensified, drumming against the leaves overhead. Water dripped down Elise's neck, but she barely noticed. Her entire focus was on Scout's movements, reading his body language as they'd practiced so many times in the clinic yard. His tail was high, his muscles taut with purpose. This wasn't the hesitant searching she'd seen in their training sessions. Scout moved with absolute certainty. "How far have we gone?" Rick called from behind, his voice nearly lost in a sudden gust of wind. One of the volunteers checked his GPS. "Almost 2 miles from base. We're well outside the initial search radius." Elise's stomach tightened. They'd given Scout 15 minutes. Surely that time was almost up. But before she could check her watch, Scout's behavior changed dramatically. His steady pulling became more urgent, and a high-pitched whine escaped his throat. "Wait," Elise called out, forcing herself to stay calm despite her racing heart. "He's got something." Scout circled an enormous fallen tree, its massive root system torn from the ground to create a natural shelter. The whining increased as he pressed his nose toward the dark space beneath the twisted roots. Elise dropped to her knees in the mud, ignoring the cold seeping through her jeans. She leaned forward, squinting into the shadows. At first, she saw nothing but dirt and tangled roots. Then her eyes adjusted, and her breath caught in her throat. A small figure was curled up in the furthest corner of the root cavity, knees pulled tight to chest, completely still. "Maggie!" Rick's voice cracked as he rushed forward. "Oh God, Maggie!" Elise held up her hand, stopping him from rushing in. "Let me check her first." Her veterinary training took over, pushing aside the surge of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She crawled carefully into the space, speaking softly. "Maggie? Sweetie, can you hear me?" The little girl's eyes fluttered open, glazed with exhaustion and fear. Her clothes were completely soaked, her lips tinged slightly blue. But she was conscious, and when Elise gently took her wrist, she found a pulse, weak, but steady and regular. Daddy?" Maggie's voice was barely a whisper. "He's right here, sweetheart." Elise shifted slightly, making room for Rick to see his daughter. "We're going to get you out of here, okay?" One of the volunteers was already on the radio, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "Base, this is Team 3. We found her. She's alive. Repeat, we found her. Need immediate medical assistance at our GPS coordinates." The response was immediate, crackling through the rain. "Copy that, Team 3. EMTs en route. Hold position." Everything happened quickly after that. The sound of crashing undergrowth announced the arrival of the emergency medical team, their powerful lights cutting through the darkness. They worked efficiently, carefully extracting Maggie from her hiding place and wrapping her in silver thermal blankets. Scout stood back from the commotion, pressing against Elise's legs as the medics worked. His job was done. Elise knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his damp fur. "You did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You really did it." The walk back to base took longer than the search, with the medics carefully carrying Maggie on a lightweight stretcher. Scout stayed close to Elise, occasionally bumping against her leg when the terrain got particularly rough. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle, but no one seemed to notice any more. When they finally emerged from the trees into the parking lot, they found it transformed. Additional emergency vehicles had arrived, their lights painting the wet pavement in swirling red and blue. A crowd had gathered at the perimeter, held back by police tape. Maggie's mother broke through the barrier, running toward them with a cry that seemed to contain every emotion possible. She reached the stretcher just as the medics were loading it into the ambulance, her hands touching Maggie's face, her hair reassuring herself that her daughter was real and alive. Through her tears, she turned to Elise. "Thank you," she sobbed, pulling Elise into a fierce hug. "Thank you so much." Rick was right behind her, his eyes red, but his voice steady. "That dog of yours," he said, shaking his head in amazement. "He's got Coda's gift, maybe even stronger." Elise noticed movement at the edge of the crowd. A news van had pulled up, and a reporter was setting up camera equipment, gesturing in their direction. But Elise shook her head firmly when they approached. "This isn't about publicity," she said quietly, turning away from the cameras. The drive home was surreal. Scout dozed in the passenger seat while Elise's mind raced, trying to process everything that had happened. Her hands were still shaking slightly on the steering wheel, adrenaline slowly giving way to exhaustion. When they finally reached the clinic, Elise led Scout inside and straight to her office. She placed Maggie's stuffed rabbit, which someone had pressed into her hands during the chaos, beside Scout's bed. He sniffed it briefly before curling up, clearly as tired as she was. Elise sat at her desk and opened her laptop. The screen's glow felt harsh after so many hours in the darkness. She opened a blank document and stared at the cursor for a long moment, her fingers hovering over the keys. Finally, she began to type, "The Scout Unit, Draft Proposal." The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when Elise pulled into the clinic's parking lot. She blinked, confused by the cluster of people gathered near the front door. At least a dozen locals stood in a makeshift line, some holding boxes or bags, others clutching newspapers. Scout lifted his head from the passenger seat, nose twitching at the unfamiliar scents. "What in the world?" Elise muttered, parking in her usual spot behind the building. As she led Scout through the back entrance, Marco burst through the staff door, looking both excited and overwhelmed. "You might want to see this," he said, thrusting a local newspaper into her hands. There on the front page was a grainy photo of Scout, taken during last night's rescue. The headline read, "Blind Clinic Dog Leads Rescuers to Missing Child." Elise's stomach tightened. "They've been showing up since dawn," Marco explained, gesturing toward the front. "Some want to donate supplies, others just want to meet him. Mrs. Chen from the Chinese restaurant brought enough food to feed us for a week." Elise ran a hand through her hair, trying to process this unexpected development. "We have appointments today, real patients who need care." "Janet's already started organizing the waiting room to keep things flowing," Marco assured her. "But these people, they're not going away. This means something to them, Elise." Before she could respond, the phone rang again, the fifth time in as many minutes. Marco grabbed it while Elise retreated to her office, Scout padding quietly beside her. She needed a moment to think, to plan, but the morning wouldn't allow it. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Dr. Warren?" Janet poked her head in. "The Hendersons are here for Tommy's vaccinations, and there's a reporter from Channel 5 asking for a statement. Also, the police chief called. Something about starting a K-9 training partnership." The day became a blur of regular appointments mixed with constant interruptions. People kept trying to peek into the back area, hoping to catch a glimpse of Scout. Some brought pet supplies, beds, toys, training equipment. Others came with checks wanting to support whatever program Elise might develop. Around noon, a distinguished-looking woman in a business suit requested a meeting. She introduced herself as Catherine Blackwood, director of a local charitable foundation. "We've been looking to fund innovative community programs," Catherine explained, sitting primly in Elise's office while Scout dozed nearby. "What you did last night, that's exactly the kind of impact we want to support. We could provide funding for additional staff, training facilities, whatever you need to expand this into a proper unit." Elise shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure I'm the right person for this. Last night was unexpected. Scout and I were just trying to help." Catherine leaned forward. "That's exactly why you are the right person. You saw potential where others saw limitations. Think about it, please." After she left, Marco brought in a stack of messages. 3 police departments want to know if you can consult on their K-9 programs. 2 dog trainers want to partner with you, and the county search and rescue team is interested in establishing a regular training schedule. Elise stared at the pile of papers, feeling the familiar weight of anxiety pressing down on her chest. The last time she'd been in the spotlight, it had ended with a devastating malpractice case that nearly destroyed her career. The thought of putting herself out there again, of being responsible for more than just her small clinic. A movement caught her eye. Nina had slipped quietly into the office, taking her usual spot in the corner chair. She had her notebook out and was watching Scout with intense focus. Over the past few days, she'd begun documenting his training sessions in her own way. Detailed drawings of his movements, careful notes about his responses to different scents. Marco had mentioned that Nina's teachers were amazed by her recent progress. She'd started participating more in class, even raising her hand occasionally to answer questions. The change had started after she began spending time with Scout. Now, Nina was actually humming softly as she sketched, something Marco said he hadn't heard her do in years. Scout's ears perked up at the sound, and he moved to lay his head gently in her lap. She didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, her free hand automatically went to scratch behind his ears. The afternoon brought more visitors, more phone calls, more offers of support. Elise tried to maintain some semblance of normal clinic operations, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. Every time she stepped into the waiting room, people wanted to talk about Scout, about the rescue, about what this could mean for the community. By evening, exhaustion had settled deep into Elise's bones. The clinic was finally quiet, the last of the day's visitors gone. She sat at her desk, attempting to catch up on patient charts while Scout snoozed in his bed. Her email notification chimed, and she clicked it without thinking. The subject line made her blood run cold. Formal investigation notice. The message was from the State Veterinary Board, its tone coldly official. They had received a complaint about unauthorized training practices being conducted at her clinic. Attached was a photo, clearly taken without her knowledge, showing her working with Scout in the backlot several days ago. Elise's hands trembled as she read through the detailed list of potential violations. The board was concerned about liability issues, questioning whether her facility was properly certified for dog training. They wanted documentation of Scout's medical history, proof of insurance coverage for these activities, training certificates she didn't have. The final paragraph mentioned possible disciplinary action, including license suspension pending review. Just like before, someone was trying to take everything away. Only this time, it wasn't just her career at stake, it was Scout's future and the hope he'd begun to represent for people like Nina. Elise closed her laptop slowly, the screen's glow fading to darkness. Scout lifted his head, sensing her distress, and patted over to rest his chin on her knee. In the quiet of the empty clinic, Elise could hear the distant sound of traffic and the soft whir of the heating system, but all she could focus on was the steady rhythm of Scout's breathing against her leg. The morning sun cast long shadows through the clinic windows as Elise organized patient files at the front desk. Scout lay nearby, his head resting on his paws, while Nina sat cross-legged beside him, sketching in her notebook. The quiet routine of the day was suddenly interrupted by the sound of car doors slamming in the parking lot. Through the front windows, Elise spotted 3 people in business attire, walking purposefully toward the entrance. Her heart skipped a beat when she recognized the county seal on their badges. "Nina, honey," she said softly, "why don't you take Scout to my office for a little while?" The girl nodded, gently leading Scout away just as the officials entered. A woman in a charcoal suit stepped forward. "Dr. Warren? I'm Linda Matthews from the County Health Department. These are my colleagues from Veterinary Services and Animal Control. We're here for an unannounced facility inspection." Elise straightened her white coat, trying to keep her voice steady. "Of course. Let me just inform my staff." Marco appeared from the back, sensing the tension. Elise gave him a quick nod, and he understood immediately, moving to handle the waiting room while she led the inspectors through the clinic. The inspection was methodical and uncomfortably thorough. Linda made notes on her tablet as her colleagues examined every corner of the facility. They checked expiration dates on medications, reviewed sterilization logs, and scrutinized the clinic's filing system. "Your surgical suite appears to be in order," Linda commented, but her tone suggested there was more coming. "However, we need to discuss some concerning reports about activities outside your licensed scope of practice." They moved toward Elise's office, where Scout and Nina were still waiting. Nina sensed the tension and quietly slipped out, giving Scout's ear a gentle pat before leaving. "Dr. Warren," Linda began, consulting her tablet, "we've identified several violations that require immediate attention." She glanced pointedly at Scout. "First, you're currently exceeding your facility's authorized animal housing capacity. Our records show you're keeping 2 animals on site, this dog and another foster case, which violates Section 4.2 of your operating license." Elise's throat tightened. "They're both temporary cases, being monitored for—" "Second," Linda continued, cutting her off, "you've been conducting behavior modification and scent training without proper certification or facilities. This type of work requires specific licenses, which your clinic does not possess." The third inspector, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "Most concerning is your involvement in last week's search and rescue operation. You deployed an uncertified animal in an official police action, potentially putting both the missing child and the search team at risk. There's no documentation of proper clearance or liability coverage for such activities." Elise felt her face grow hot. "Scout found that little girl when nobody else could. He dash. The outcome, while fortunate, doesn't excuse the violation of protocols," Linda interrupted. "Dr. Warren, you've put yourself in a precarious position. Your recent actions have triggered a review of your veterinary license." The room fell silent, except for the soft sound of Scout's tail thumping against the floor. He had moved closer to Elise, perhaps sensing her distress. Linda's expression softened slightly. "We're prepared to offer you 2 options. First, you can immediately cease all training activities and surrender the dog to a certified training center where his abilities can be properly developed under licensed supervision." "And the second option?" Elise asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Face license suspension pending a full review by the state board. Given your previous difficulties, I strongly advise against this path." The reference to her past malpractice case felt like a physical blow. Elise gripped the edge of her desk, steadying herself. "How long do I have to decide?" "You have 48 hours to provide written notification of your choice. If we don't receive it, we'll proceed with suspension procedures." Linda handed her a thick envelope of paperwork. "All the details are in here, including contact information for approved training centers." After the officials left, Elise sat heavily in her office chair. Scout immediately moved to her side, pressing against her leg. She pulled out her phone with trembling hands and dialed Kendra's number. "They want me to give him up," she said as soon as Kendra answered, her voice cracking. "They're saying I'm operating outside my scope, that I need special licenses for everything we've been doing." Kendra listened patiently as Elise explained the situation. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "They're technically right about the licensing requirements, Elise, but that doesn't mean they're right about Scout. What can I do? They're threatening my license again. After everything that happened last time." Elise trailed off, running her fingers through Scout's fur. "You won't win this without a fight," Kendra said honestly. "But the longer you delay, the more they'll use it against you. They're counting on you being too scared to challenge them." Elise looked down at Scout, who had rested his chin on her knee. His cloudy eyes might not have been able to see her, but his presence was steady and reassuring, just as it had been for Nina, for Maggie, for everyone he'd touched in his short time at the clinic. "I don't want to let them take you," she whispered to Scout, her free hand scratching behind his ears. The early morning mist clung to the grass as Elise pulled into the empty clinic parking lot. The sun hadn't yet risen, casting everything in soft gray shadows. She sat in her car for a long moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, before reaching over to clip Scout's leash to his collar. "Come on, boy," she whispered, her voice thick. "Let's take a walk." Scout hopped out of the car with his usual careful grace, nose already working to map out the familiar territory. His paws made soft padding sounds against the wet pavement as they circled the building together. Elise walked slowly, deliberately, letting memories wash over her with each step. Here was where they'd done their first serious scent trial, Scout discovering a hidden toy beneath a stack of empty boxes. There was the bench where Nina had first reached out to touch him, that tiny smile breaking through her usual reserved expression. And around back, the spot where they'd started that fateful night, when Scout had picked up Maggie's scent from her stuffed rabbit. The morning air felt heavy with the weight of what was coming. Scout seemed to sense it too, staying closer to Elise's side than usual, occasionally brushing against her leg as they walked. When they reached the side door of the clinic, Elise's hand trembled slightly as she turned the key. Inside, she went through her morning routine mechanically. Fill the coffee maker, check the appointment schedule, turn on the computers. But everything felt wrong, like she was moving through a dream. Scout settled into his usual spot near her desk, his cloudy eyes tracking her movements by sound. The sun was just beginning to peek through the windows when she heard Marco's truck pull up outside. A car door slammed, followed by the sound of two sets of footsteps, Marco's steady stride and Nina's lighter steps. Elise's stomach clenched. This was the part she'd been dreading most. Marco appeared in the doorway first, his expression concerned. Nina stood slightly behind him. Her noise-canceling headphones hung around her neck instead of over her ears for once. Scout's tail thumped softly against the floor at their arrival, but he didn't get up. "Elise?" Marco's voice was gentle, questioning. He could always read her too well. She took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "I need to tell you both something." The words felt like glass in her throat. "I've made a decision about Scout." Nina moved further into the office, her eyes darting between Elise and the dog. Marco's expression shifted from concern to understanding, then to something like protest. "I'm turning him over to the city's K-9 training unit," Elise continued, forcing the words out before she lost her nerve. "They have the proper licenses, facilities, everything he needs to develop his skills properly." "No," Marco said immediately, stepping forward. "There has to be another way. We can fight this, get the licenses ourselves." "We can't," Elise cut him off, her voice firm despite the ache in her chest. "If I lose my license, I lose the clinic. If I lose the clinic..." She gestured around them, encompassing everything. The waiting room where they'd helped countless animals, the surgery where they'd saved lives, the whole small but vital practice they'd built together. "I lose everything for everyone. All our patients, all our work. I can't risk that." Nina had gone very still, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Scout got up and moved to her side, pressing gently against her leg like he always did. The gesture nearly broke Elise's composure. A knock at the front door made them all jump. Two officers from the K-9 unit stood outside, their uniforms crisp in the morning light. One held a clipboard, the other a professional transport harness. Elise's hand shook as she signed the transfer forms. The officers were kind but efficient, explaining how Scout would be evaluated and integrated into their training program. They promised to keep her updated on his progress, but the words felt hollow in her ears. When they brought out the new harness, Scout stood perfectly still, as if he understood the gravity of the moment. The officer had to call him twice before he moved away from Nina's side. As they led him toward the door, he turned his head back once, nose working to catch their scents one last time. Nina moved suddenly, pulling something from her backpack. It was Scout's old collar, the worn leather one with his original message scratched beneath the buckle. She held it out to Elise without a word, then turned and walked quickly toward the back of the clinic, her shoulders tight. The sound of the van's doors closing seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet morning air. Elise watched through the window as they drove away. Scout's old collar clutched tightly in her hands. The leather was warm from Nina's grip, and Elise could still feel the raised edges of those scratched words. "My name is Scout. I find things. Please don't give up on me." The day passed in a blur of appointments and paperwork, each minute feeling somehow both endless and too quick. Nina stayed in the back room, organizing supplies with mechanical precision, not speaking to anyone. Marco handled the front desk, fielding calls and managing the flow of patients, giving Elise space to work through her surgeries on autopilot. When evening finally came, Elise sat alone in her darkened office. The computer screen cast a pale blue glow over her desk, where Scout's collar lay next to her keyboard. Her email inbox was flooded with new messages. Word of Scout's success with finding Maggie had spread through the community, bringing requests for appointments, training sessions, even some speaking engagements. She selected them all without opening them, moved them to a folder she knew she wouldn't check. Then she opened her Documents folder and found the file labeled The Scout Unit Draft Proposal. Her cursor hovered over the Delete button for a long moment before she clicked, watching as the file disappeared, taking with it all her plans and hopes for what could have been. The empty office felt cavernous around her. No click of nails on the floor, no soft breathing from the corner, no gentle presence pressing against her leg when the silence grew too heavy. Just the quiet hum of the computer and the weight of everything she'd given up pressing down on her shoulders. 3 weeks dragged by at Westbridge Veterinary Clinic like a slow-moving fog. The familiar rhythm of appointments, surgeries, and paperwork continued, but something vital had drained from the atmosphere. The building itself seemed to feel Scout's absence. The corners where he used to rest lay empty. The backyard where he trained remained unused. Elise moved through her days with mechanical precision, her face a careful mask of professional detachment. Her examination notes, once detailed and thoughtful, had become sparse and clinical. Patient presenting with URI symptoms. Prescribed amoxicillin. Follow-up in 10 days. No more observations about temperament, no behavioral notes, no extra details that might help with future visits. The morning light filtered through the waiting room windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Elise sat at her desk, reviewing charts from the previous day. Her coffee had gone cold, untouched beside her keyboard. The wall beside her desk showed a blank space where Scout's training progress photos used to hang. Marco watched her through the doorway, concern etched on his features. He'd noticed how she avoided the storage closet where they kept the training equipment, the scent jars, the puzzle feeders, the special harnesses. Everything remained exactly as it had been the day Scout left, gathering dust. "Dr. Warren?" He knocked gently on the doorframe. "Your 9 o'clock is here." Elise nodded without looking up. "Standard vaccine appointment?" "Yeah. And they brought their new rescue. Might need some behavioral consultation." Something flickered across Elise's face. Pain, perhaps, or resignation. "Just the vaccines today. Refer them to Central Valley for behavior work. We're not equipped for that anymore. Marco stepped into the office, closing the door behind him. Elise, you can't keep shutting down every training opportunity. The clinic needs to stay within its licensed scope, Elise cut him off, her voice flat. We do vaccines, surgeries, and standard care. Nothing more. The silence that followed felt heavy. Marco shifted his weight, then said quietly, Nina's been asking about coming back. She misses Dash. Tell her we're fully staffed right now. Elise stood abruptly, gathering her stethoscope. I need to get to that appointment. As she brushed past him, Marco noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. The spark that had animated her during Scout's training, that mixture of purpose and possibility, had dimmed to nearly nothing. The morning crept by. Elise moved from exam room to exam room, her movements efficient but lifeless. During a brief lunch break, she sat alone in her office, mechanically eating a sandwich while checking emails. One subject line made her freeze. K9 Training Unit, Scout Status Update. Her hand trembled slightly as she opened the message. The official report was clinical, but the implications were clear. Scout was physically healthy, but showing significant signs of anxiety and withdrawal. He wasn't bonding with handlers or responding to standard training protocols. His assessment scores were well below acceptable levels for service work. Elise read the report 3 times, her throat tight. She could picture Scout, confused and withdrawn, trying to navigate a sterile training facility without the connections he'd built here, without Nina's gentle presence or Marco's steady voice, without. Her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. The caller ID showed Dr. Kendra Holloway's name. Hello? Elise's voice came out rougher than she intended. I just got the report, Kendra said without preamble. Have you seen it? Yes. Elise pushed her half-eaten sandwich away. I expected this, honestly. He wasn't ready for formal training. That's not the issue, and you know it. Kendra's tone was firm but kind. Scout's capabilities aren't the problem. He's shutting down because he lost his support system, his person. Elise closed her eyes, pain lancing through her chest. I didn't have a choice. I know, but things have changed. The facility is preparing to release him as non-compatible for service work. They'll probably try to place him in foster care or a long-term kennel situation. The thought of Scout languishing in a kennel made Elise's stomach turn. When? Soon. But listen, I've been talking with them. They're open to a supervised retraining agreement if you're interested. We could set up a proper program, do everything by the book this time. Hope fluttered in Elise's chest, fragile and terrifying. I can't risk the clinic. We'll do it right, Kendra assured her. I'll help with the paperwork, the certifications, everything. But Elise? Her voice softened. They need an answer soon. He's waiting for you, if you still want him. After the call ended, Elise sat motionless at her desk. The afternoon appointments passed in a blur. As soon as the last patient left, she grabbed her keys and walked out without a word to anyone. She drove aimlessly at first, but her car seemed to know where to go. 20 minutes later, she found herself pulling into the gravel lot at Pine Ridge Overlook. This was where she and Scout had practiced advanced scent tracking, hiding toys and treats among the rocks and trees. The evening air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles and approaching rain. Elise got out of the car and walked to the wooden railing. The valley spread out below her, painted in shades of green and gold by the setting sun. She remembered watching Scout navigate this terrain, how his blindness never seemed to matter when he was following a scent, how his determination had inspired Nina to try new things, had reminded Elise herself what it meant to trust your instincts. The sky darkened gradually, stars beginning to appear overhead. Elise pulled out her phone and stared at it for a long moment. Finally, her fingers moved across the screen, typing a message to Marco. "Tell Nina he's coming home." The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of the City K-9 training facility as Elise pulled into an empty space. The building loomed before her, all glass, steel, and concrete, nothing like the warm wooden walls of her clinic. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with tension. Inside, the lobby was as sterile as a hospital. The chemical smell of industrial cleaner hung in the air, mixing with the faint scent of dog shampoo and rubber training equipment. Elise sat rigidly in one of the hard plastic chairs, a manila envelope of paperwork clutched in her lap. Her leg bounced with nervous energy as she waited. A young staff member in a crisp uniform approached, clipboard in hand. "Dr. Warren, we're just finalizing the transfer documents." She hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "I should warn you. He's been very unresponsive lately. He might not remember you. We've seen this before, with long separations." Elise nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The words echoed in her head as she filled out form after form. Medical history, training protocols, liability waivers. Her signature looked shaky on the final page. Minutes stretched like hours. The click of computer keyboards and murmur of office phones filled the silence. Elise found herself straining to hear any sound of dogs from the back area. Barking, walking, anything. But the thick walls muffled everything. Finally, a door buzzed open. A handler emerged, leading Scout on a standard-issue nylon leash. Elise's heart clenched. He looked thinner than before, his coat duller. His head hung low, unseeing eyes pointed at the ground. Gone was the confident, curious pup who had once navigated her clinic with such precision. Elise slowly knelt on the cold tile floor, her throat tight. Scout stood perfectly still, showing none of the excitement she remembered. His body language was closed off, tail low and still. "Hey, Scout," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You still find things?" For a moment, nothing changed. Then Scout's head tilted slightly, nostrils flaring. He took a tentative step forward, sniffing the air. Elise held her breath, afraid to move, afraid to hope. Suddenly, his tail lifted and began to wag. The movement started slow, then picked up speed. Scout moved forward with growing confidence, pressing his nose against her shoulder. Then, to everyone's surprise, he let out a short, sharp bark. The first sound he'd made in weeks, according to the startled handler. "There you are," Elise whispered, wrapping her arms around him. Scout pressed closer, his whole body wiggling now with recognition and joy. The staff members exchanged amazed looks as Scout transformed before their eyes, from a withdrawn, failed candidate into an energetic, engaged dog. The facility director brought out the final document, a conditional rehoming agreement. It outlined strict requirements, regular progress reports, supervised training sessions, proper certification procedures. Elise signed without hesitation, her hands steady this time. The drive back to Westbridge felt surreal. Scout lay in the back seat, his head resting on the center console near Elise's elbow. Every few minutes she reached back to touch him, reassuring herself that he was really there. The morning traffic moved slowly, but Elise didn't mind. Each mile put more distance between Scout and the sterile facility that had dimmed his spirit. As they turned onto the clinic's street, Elise spotted two familiar figures waiting by the front door. Marco stood with his hands in his pockets, trying to appear casual, but clearly anxious. Beside him, Nina bounced slightly on her toes, her hands clasped tightly together. Before Elise could even put the car in park, Nina was moving. She rushed forward as Elise opened the back door, all her usual caution forgotten in her excitement. Scout emerged from the car and froze, momentarily overwhelmed by the sudden movement. Elise started to call out a warning, to remind Nina about approaching slowly, but before she could speak, something remarkable happened. Scout's posture shifted. His ears perked forward, and his movements became deliberately gentle. He walked toward Nina with careful steps, reading her energy perfectly. When he reached her, Scout pressed his head softly against her chest. Their old greeting, remembered perfectly. Nina's arms wrapped around him as tears spilled down her cheeks. She buried her face in his fur, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Marco stepped closer, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Welcome home, buddy," he said gruffly, reaching down to scratch Scout's ears. They stayed like that for several long moments, Nina holding Scout, Marco standing guard, Elise watching the reunion with her heart so full it hurt. Finally, Scout pulled back slightly and gave Nina's face a gentle lick, making her giggle through her tears. That evening, after the clinic closed and the excitement settled, Elise sat at her computer. The cursor blinked on a blank document, but this time the empty page didn't feel daunting. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with purpose, typing out a title she'd written once before. The Scout Unit, Integrated Scent and Therapy Dog Program. This time, she didn't save it to her drafts folder. Instead, she attached it to an email addressed to Kendra and 3 potential donors who had expressed interest before. The subject line was simple but decisive. Proposal, Phase 1 launch. Scout dozed in his bed beside her desk, his breathing deep and peaceful. As Elise's finger hovered over the send button, he lifted his head and wagged his tail once, as if giving his approval. 3 months had transformed the modest veterinary clinic into something entirely new. The Scout Unit occupied what was once storage space, now converted into a specialized wing that hummed with purpose. The entrance hallway told a story through carefully arranged photographs, moments frozen in time that captured Scout's remarkable journey. The first photo showed Scout on the night he found Maggie, the lost 6-year-old. In it, the German Shepherd stood alert despite his unseeing eyes, his nose pointed toward the dark woods where he'd tracked her scent. Beside it hung a more recent image, Maggie visiting Scout, her small arms wrapped around his neck while he sat patiently, tail mid-wag. Further down the hall, a series of photos documented Scout's work with Nina. The earliest showed her sitting cautiously beside him, her noise-canceling headphones firmly in place. In later images, the headphones disappeared, replaced by a growing smile as she helped with training sessions. The final photo captured Nina explaining hand signals to a younger child, while Scout demonstrated perfect attention beside her. The remodeled space itself was thoughtfully designed. The main training area featured non-slip rubber flooring and clear pathways marked with textured strips to help Scout and other dogs navigate independently. Scent workstations lined one wall, rows of identical boxes, hidden item courses, and specialized equipment Kendra had recommended. The therapy lounge occupied the opposite end, furnished with comfortable seating, soft lighting, and calming colors, chosen specifically to create a welcoming environment for children and veterans. On this particular morning, Elise moved through the space with quiet confidence, leading a small group of hospital administrators on a tour. They carried clipboards and spoke in hushed tones, watching intently as Scout demonstrated his abilities. Scout works primarily through scent discrimination, Elise explained, setting up a simple exercise. She placed 3 identical containers on the floor, then showed the group a small cloth bag. This contains items that might be lost in a hospital setting: keys, phones, ID badges. Scout can locate specific items even when they're mixed with similar scents. The administrators leaned forward as Scout worked, his nose moving methodically from one container to the next. When he identified the correct one, he sat precisely, tail wagging gently. One of the administrators made rapid notes. The real breakthrough, Elise continued, has been combining scent work with therapy applications. She gestured toward a corner where two other dogs, a calm golden retriever and a gentle Labrador mix, rested on beds. These are our newest trainees. They're learning to work with different populations while maintaining Scout's careful, non-intrusive approach. Outside, Marco directed volunteers setting up for the afternoon's open house. Tables lined the parking lot, decorated with blue and silver balloons, the colors Nina had chosen for the Scout unit's logo. Information packets described their programs: scent detection training, therapy dog certification, and specialized sessions for children with sensory processing challenges. Nina moved between the tables with growing confidence, adjusting displays and greeting early arrivals. Though she still spoke softly, her voice carried conviction as she addressed a small group of parents and their children. Scout showed me it was okay to be different, she explained, her hands steady as she demonstrated proper ways to approach a therapy dog. He doesn't see the world like other dogs, but that makes him special. He taught me that being different isn't wrong. It's just another way of experiencing things. The parents exchanged meaningful looks as their children listened, captivated by Nina's gentle authority. One mother wiped away tears when Nina described how Scout had helped her feel comfortable, removing her headphones in public for the first time. Inside, Elise concluded the hospital tour with a final demonstration. Scout worked with a young veteran, showing how he could provide gentle pressure during anxiety attacks and create a calm space in overwhelming situations. The administrators huddled together, whispering and nodding. "We'd like to move forward with the partnership," the lead administrator announced. "Your results speak for themselves, Doctor. Warren, we'll have legal draw up the paperwork next week." As the day wound down and the last visitors departed, Elise took Scout for their evening walk behind the clinic. The path they followed was familiar now, worn smooth by months of training sessions and quiet moments together. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the grass. Elise knelt beside Scout, taking a moment to scratch behind his ears, his favorite spot. From her pocket, she withdrew a new collar, the leather soft and supple. The old one had served its purpose, carrying him from abandoned pup to celebrated partner. But it was time for something that reflected who he'd become. With gentle hands, she unbuckled the worn collar and slipped the new one into place. The tag caught the fading sunlight, its engraving clear and proud. "My name is Scout. I find things, and I always come home." Scout stood perfectly still as she adjusted the fit, his tail wagging slowly. When she finished, he pressed his head against her shoulder, their private gesture of connection. The sense of approaching autumn filled the air. Crisp leaves, distant wood smoke, the promise of change. Elise looked toward the woods where Scout had once tracked Maggie, where their shared journey had truly begun. The trees stood tall and dark against the dimming sky, a reminder of how far they'd come from that desperate night. "We built this together, didn't we?" she said softly, her voice carrying all the pride and wonder of their accomplishments. Scout's response was a single bark, soft and sure, echoing briefly before fading into the peaceful evening air. If you enjoyed the story of Elise and Scout, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.